Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
He stood at the head of the conference room table, beaming like a high school quarterback, announcing his college draft. Everyone, meet our new regional director of operations, Greg McClellan. He even added a little applause for show, the kind that dies quickly because nobody else knows what the hell they're clapping for. I stood near the back, half a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching this guy, khakis pressed like origami, smile full of capped teeth, shake hands with people he hadn't met until this morning. Carl Bennett, my boss, threw a wink in my direction. A wink. Like we shared some inside joke about the cruel joke being played on me. I'd been working under Carl for a little over 3 years. In that time, I'd led 2 major regional restructurings, doubled our logistics efficiency in 3 states, and trained 3 of the people now above me on the org chart. I was the first one in, last one out, brought ideas to the table, solved fires before they started. Hell, I once spent Christmas Eve driving 4 hours to personally fix a warehouse tech glitch because Carl was on vacation with limited service. Every quarter, he'd promise me the next one was mine. "You're in line for it," he'd say. "We just need to clean up this budget report," or "corporate's still finalizing the new pay bands." He was the king of delay tactics, and I, like an idiot, kept buying them. That morning, I didn't even know a hiring decision had been made. Greg apparently was Carl's golf buddy. They met at some fundraiser for mid-tier executives and bonded over scotch and 9 irons. That's what Carl told me later that afternoon, when I finally cornered him in his office and asked what the hell just happened. He acted surprised. "Oh, I thought I looped you in. No? Damn, that's on me. Listen, John, you're invaluable, man. But Greg's got some serious industry connections. This is strategic. You get it, right?" I nodded. Of course I nodded. What else was I going to do? Flip his desk? I swallowed the acid, burning up the back of my throat, and said something about team growth and long-term vision. Meanwhile, my palms were shaking, and my vision was tunneling like I was about to black out. I walked out of that room with a smile painted on my face, but it felt like someone had kicked out my knees and told me to keep walking. The rest of the day was a blur. I think I answered emails. Maybe I did some onboarding paperwork for Greg, who kept calling me buddy and asking where the good coffee was. People came by my desk with those awkward looks, the kind you get at funerals when nobody knows if they should say something or just pretend it didn't happen. A few whispered, "That should have been you," and I thanked them without making eye contact. That night, I sat in the parking lot long after the sun dipped behind the overpass, just staring at the steering wheel. I didn't go home. I drove to a bar I used to hit back in my 20s, sat at the far end, and drank 2 neat bourbons like I was on a mission. I wasn't even mad yet. I was numb. My phone buzzed with a text from my wife asking if I was okay, and I didn't even know how to answer. Because honestly, I didn't know. Back home, I crawled into bed without a word. She stirred and asked, "Bad day?" I said, "Just long," and she went back to sleep. I lay there, eyes wide open, heart thumping like it wanted to break through my chest. My mind kept looping the same scene. Carl, smiling like he'd done me a favor, and Greg shaking hands with my future. My promotion, my reward for years of loyalty, gone. What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back like this? Not just passed you over, but handed your future to a guy he drinks bourbon with on Saturdays while telling you to keep up the good work. Would you swallow it, let it slide? Would you smile and show up Monday like nothing happened? Because that's what I did. For now. The next few days felt like walking barefoot on gravel. Every hallway conversation, every meeting invite, every email CC with Greg's name on it made my skin crawl. I kept my head down, did my work, even helped Greg navigate a few reporting tools. "You're a lifesaver," he said one afternoon, and I almost laughed out loud. Yeah, I bet I was. Carl stayed out of my way, which told me everything I needed to know. He didn't feel guilty. He felt clever, like he'd pulled off a switcheroo and was proud of how smooth it went down. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Carl slipping out early, Carl scheduling random off-site meetings, Carl coming back from lunch with that smug aftertaste of knowing something the rest of us didn't. And Greg? Greg was just along for the ride. No clue what was happening behind the scenes, no sense that the house he just moved into was built on someone else's sweat. I kept smiling, kept showing up, but inside, something was shifting. A new kind of fire. Not the burn of ambition, but the slow, smoldering kind. The kind you hide under ashes, wait for the wind to change, and then blow it into something much bigger. Something Carl never saw coming. For the next week and a half, I wore my professional face like a mask I couldn't peel off, even when it started to crack around the edges. I showed up on time, smiled in the hallway, gave polite nods during Greg's half-baked presentations, and even tossed in a few friendly suggestions to make him look good. The irony didn't escape me. I was helping the guy who'd stolen my chair figure out how to sit in it. But in a place like ours, where appearances mattered more than principles and team players were the ones who kept quiet, playing along was the only way to survive. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself as I choked down the bile that rose every time Carl called Greg a rising star. The pressure didn't hit all at once. It built slowly, like water dripping behind a wall, softening everything until even the strong beams start to rot. I stopped sleeping properly. I'd wake up at 3 a.m, heart racing, staring at the ceiling and wondering what I did wrong. I'd replay conversations with Carl, dissecting every sentence he'd ever said about my bright future. I thought about the extra hours, the birthdays missed, the weekends lost to spreadsheets and regional operations reports. I thought about how I once covered for Carl when he forgot an important budget deadline, and how he had thanked me with a pat on the back and a "You're going places, John." And now I was just a stepping stone for a guy with a Titleist hat and a LinkedIn page full of fluff. At home, I wasn't much better. My wife Claire saw it before I said a word. I wasn't myself. I wasn't present. I'd get home and just sit there, eating dinner in silence or half watching whatever show was on. She asked me one night if everything was okay, and I told her it was just a rough patch at work, which, while technically true, didn't come close to the truth. The truth was, something in me had cracked. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was still too stunned, too disoriented, but there was a sense of humiliation festering just beneath the surface. And shame. That was the worst part. Not at them, at me, for being so stupid, for trusting Carl, for thinking that hard work was some kind of armor that would protect me from this kind of betrayal. Greg, for his part, tried to be friendly. He wasn't a bad guy, not exactly, just oblivious. The kind of guy who didn't know how little he knew, but assumed people would explain it to him eventually. He asked for my help at least twice a day, usually in that casual, "Hey buddy, quick question" tone that made me want to slam my head into a filing cabinet. I helped him. Of course I did, because not helping would make me look bitter. And bitterness, in a corporate environment, is like blood in the water. People start circling. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, something shifted. Carl was out of the office for some vendor meeting, at least that's what his calendar said, and I happened to be walking by his desk on my way to grab a package from reception. His screen was still on. That alone was unusual, considering Carl was the kind of guy who locked his workstation if he so much as stood up to stretch. But there it was, bright and open, like a door someone forgot to shut. Curiosity is a funny thing. It doesn't whisper, it roars. So I looked. Just a glance. 10 seconds, tops. What I saw wasn't dramatic. Just a folder open on his desktop with a PDF invoice sitting front and center. The header had the name of a logistics consultancy we hadn't used in over a year, and the billing address wasn't one I recognized. It was small, weird, and absolutely none of my business. But it stuck in my brain like a splinter. The next day, I Googled the company name and found a placeholder website that hadn't been updated in years. Something didn't add up. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, or even why I was looking. But once you start pulling threads, it's hard to stop. That invoice rattled around in my mind while I sat through meetings, answered Greg's clueless questions, and smiled at Carl's smug hallway nods. There was something off. I could feel it, and I needed to know what it was. Meanwhile, my performance reviews were coming up. Usually, Carl gave me the rundown in advance, told me what to expect, how he'd word things for the higher-ups. This time, nothing. I found out the day before that my review had been pushed back indefinitely, due to scheduling conflicts, which was code for, "We're not interested in promoting you anymore, but we're too cowardly to say it." That night, Claire found me sitting in the garage, staring at a blank wall like it owed me answers. She asked what was wrong again, and this time I told her. Not everything, just the broad strokes. Her face tightened. "So they used you," she said. I nodded. "So what are you going to do about it?" I didn't know yet, but I knew I was done pretending it didn't matter. I was done being the good soldier, the guy who smiled while the rug got yanked from under his feet. Loyalty had gotten me nothing but high blood pressure and a front row seat to my own humiliation. From now on, I wasn't playing their game. I was watching, listening, waiting. And the first chance I got to push back, even a little, I was going to take it. There's a particular kind of clarity that hits you after the initial sting wears off and the bitterness settles into something colder, quieter, and more focused. By the third week, I wasn't angry in the explosive sense. No yelling, no snapping at coworkers, no breaking mugs in the break room. I'd passed that stage. What I felt was more dangerous. It was like a fog had lifted, and now everything around me looked sharper, more precise. Carl's little offhand comments, Greg's clueless bragging, the way certain reports seemed to disappear or magically realign numbers just before month end. It was all there before. I just hadn't been looking. But now I was watching with the kind of attention that comes when a man has nothing left to lose but his dignity. And even that's already taken a few hits. I started small, quiet, observant. I wasn't snooping, not really. I was just paying closer attention to the things I used to ignore. For instance, Carl had this habit of printing out documents and leaving them face down on the printer tray if he got distracted or pulled into a meeting. Nobody thought twice about it, but once you've been burned, you start thinking in possibilities. One afternoon, I waited until he left the bullpen to take a call, then wandered over to the printer under the pretense of grabbing my own materials. There, right on top, was a printed email chain between him and a vendor named S. Howard Consulting about a quarterly partnership bonus. That wouldn't be weird on its own, but the phrasing was wrong. It sounded informal, like they were negotiating under the table. I took a picture with my phone and filed it away. A few days later, I caught him slipping out with his laptop bag 15 minutes before a leadership call. Nothing strange, Carl did that a lot, but that same evening, while working late, I noticed a shared network folder with several expense reports logged under a generic travel code. I opened one. It listed a dinner with client rep at a steakhouse in the city. A place I knew well, not because I'd been taken there as an employee, but because I once had to explain to a new hire that it was way outside our travel reimbursement guidelines. The receipt showed 3 top-shelf bourbons, 2 porterhouses, and a charge tip that went well above our allowable limits. The kicker? The date of the dinner matched a weekend Carl had told the team he'd be in Chicago with his daughter for a school event. Either he'd flown home for dinner, or he was billing us for something very different. Still, all I had were questions and shadows. I needed proof, real proof, and that meant patience. I started coming in 15 minutes earlier than usual, under the pretense of prepping systems before Greg arrived, and staying late after everyone had gone home. Carl rarely locked his office, and while I never crossed any hard ethical lines, I did start noticing how many documents he left scattered on his desk. He didn't expect anyone to be curious. That was his first mistake. One Friday evening, after a long week of pretending not to notice Greg tanking another regional forecast meeting, I lingered a bit longer than usual. I walked past Carl's office, and through the half-closed blinds, I spotted something that made me stop. His laptop was open, the screensaver still spinning, and beside it was a USB stick, red, unmarked, ordinary. It could have been nothing. It could have been full of vacation photos or old PowerPoints. But something in my gut told me otherwise. I waited 10 minutes, just to be sure no one else was around, and then I stepped inside, plugged in my own drive, and copied the contents. Quick, silent, no trace. Then I left, heart pounding, palms slick, feeling more alive than I had in weeks. That night, after the family went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder. There were spreadsheets, emails, PDFs, nothing explosive at first glance, but enough that I started to see a pattern. There were duplicate vendor entries, overlapping travel logs, and strings of correspondence with names that didn't appear in our official records. One particularly damning file was a scanned invoice from Sunridge Logistics, billed to our department for consulting services. The same kind of invoice I had seen weeks ago on his open screen. I looked up Sunridge Logistics. It was a shell. A single web page, no address, no contact. The domain was registered through a proxy. That's when I knew. This wasn't laziness or shady accounting. This was intentional. Carl had built himself a backdoor revenue stream. And either no one noticed or no one had the spine to say anything. The smartest part? It was all just clean enough to be deniable. No smoking gun, no outright admission, just a long, winding trail of impropriety that would take someone weeks to untangle, unless, of course, that someone already knew where to look. And I did, because I'd been watching. Because Carl made the mistake of thinking the guy he humiliated would roll over and go quietly. Because I was no longer the loyal company man. I was the ghost in the machine. Over the next week, I compiled everything. I didn't talk to anyone, not even Claire. I scanned, organized, labeled every receipt, every misfiled expense, every time Carl used strategic partner as a smokescreen. I listened carefully when he took calls behind closed doors and noted the names he mentioned. I even caught a voicemail once, a message from someone thanking him for a quick turnaround on that check and offering to meet at the club later that week. It was all there, not neat, not obvious, but there. I wasn't ready to pull the trigger. Not yet. This had to be perfect, because once it started, there'd be no turning back. I'd either bring him down clean, or I'd be the one out the door, and if I was going out, I wasn't going quietly. Not anymore. It's strange how power shifts, not with announcements or grand gestures, but with quiet confidence and the right knowledge tucked into your pocket. Once I had Carl's dirty little side hustle mapped out, the shell vendors, the manipulated reimbursements, the emails phrased just carefully enough to suggest impropriety without outright admitting it, I started walking differently through the office, not with arrogance, and certainly not with some swagger that screamed, "Look at me," but with the subtle, steady certainty of someone holding a live wire and knowing exactly where to plug it in. Carl didn't notice. Why would he? He still thought I was licking my wounds and smiling through the betrayal like a good corporate soldier who'd accepted his fate. I waited 2 full weeks, not out of hesitation or fear, those were gone, but out of discipline. You only get one shot at this kind of thing. If you aim too low, they sweep it under the rug. Aim too high without enough ammo, and you go down with your own ship. I wanted it airtight. I wanted them to have no choice but to act, and more than anything, I wanted Carl to feel the rug vanish from under his feet with the same speed and cruelty he'd delivered to me in that conference room, where he stood beaming like a proud father while handing my promotion to Greg Golf Grip McClellan. The package I put together was meticulous. It wasn't just a list of files or a jumbled folder of blurry screenshots. No, this was a dossier, organized, indexed with context notes for each document, cross-referenced dates, email excerpts, and a few select pieces of commentary carefully framed in the tone of an impartial observer. I created an anonymous email account using a public terminal at a coffee shop across town, loaded the files onto a fresh USB drive I'd bought in cash, and embedded everything into a timed auto-send link. Then I waited for the right moment. That moment came on a Tuesday morning, shortly after Carl finished giving his usual over-caffeinated pep talk during the weekly ops huddle, where he talked about leaning into efficiencies and synergizing vertical outcomes, which meant nothing and solved nothing, but made him sound like he still had a grip on the wheel. The team nodded, Greg scribbled things he didn't understand into a notebook, and I stood in the back, counting down the seconds until he wrapped it up and disappeared into his corner office. Once he did, I went to my desk, opened my laptop, logged into the burner account, and hit send. The email went out to 3 recipients: our internal HR director, our regional compliance officer, and a contact I'd verified within the legal department at corporate headquarters. I knew better than to trust a single channel. Corporate can move fast when they want to, especially when they smell liability, but they're just as good at burying problems when it suits them. This couldn't be buried. Not this time. By noon, things started moving, quietly at first. Carl received a calendar invite from the HR director titled Follow-up on Budget Clarification. Nothing suspicious on the surface. He walked past my desk on his way out of the bullpen, gave me a wink, again with the damn winks, and said, "Hold down the fort." I gave him a thumbs up, resisting the urge to laugh in his face. He had no idea he was walking into a minefield. An hour later, the HR director came out looking pale and tight-lipped. She didn't say anything to anyone, didn't stop for small talk, just marched straight to the elevator. By mid-afternoon, a second meeting appeared on Carl's calendar, this time with both HR and legal. That's when the tension started seeping into the floor tiles. People noticed. Whispers started circulating. A few employees exchanged glances across cubicles, and one of the senior analysts, a guy named Marcus, leaned over and quietly asked me, "Do you know what's going on with Carl?" I shrugged, said I hadn't heard anything, and went back to my keyboard. But inside, my chest was buzzing like I'd swallowed a live wire. Thursday morning arrived like a scene from a slow-motion movie. Carl came in late, looking unusually disheveled, tie slightly crooked, phone clutched in his hand like it owed him money. He didn't say hello to anyone. He walked directly to his office, closed the door, and stayed there. People noticed that, too. Mid-morning, the HR director came up to our floor, followed by a man in a Navy suit from legal. They didn't knock. They just walked into his office and closed the door behind them. The rest of us tried to pretend we weren't watching, but you could feel it. The silence, the tension, the unspoken recognition that something big was unraveling behind that closed door. An hour passed, then another. Finally, just before lunch, Carl emerged. His face was blank, not angry, not embarrassed, just hollow. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He walked straight to the elevator without grabbing his jacket, laptop, or even his phone charger. The HR director followed a minute later, carrying a cardboard box with his name scribbled on the side. Nobody said a word. No one clapped. No farewell cake. Just the slow click of heels on linoleum and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Carl Bennett, the man who spent years talking about integrity and leadership and the next level, was gone, and nobody missed him. Later that afternoon, a company-wide memo arrived, full of vague language about leadership transitions and organizational realignment, the kind of corporate filler that says everything and nothing at the same time. Greg looked like someone had punched him in the gut, probably because he realized the man who championed his rise had just disappeared in disgrace. He came by my desk around 4, leaned in and said, "Do you think he did something illegal?" I looked at him for a long second and said, "Oh, no idea, man. But if he did, I'm sure it'll come out." That night, I sat in my car for almost an hour before driving home. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't angry. I was just breathing. For the first time in a long time, the air felt lighter. The weight pressing on my chest had finally lifted, and all I could do was sit there and try to remember what it felt like before everything went sideways. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Because this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the moment the scales finally tipped in my favor. Whether or not I won, that was still to be decided, but I had landed the first real blow. And Carl? Carl never saw it coming. In the days that followed Carl's exit, the office transformed into a strange and silent battlefield. Not the kind with overt conflict or dramatic showdowns, but the kind where people walked more carefully, spoke more quietly, and watched each other with eyes full of questions they didn't dare voice out loud. No one said Carl's name unless absolutely necessary, and even then it came out as a whisper, as if merely invoking it might summon back the ghost of his arrogance. His office stayed locked for a week before someone from facilities came in with a dolly and wheeled away the last of his belongings, including that ridiculous framed quote he used to hang behind his desk that read, "Don't be busy, be productive." I used to roll my eyes at that sign every time I walked past it, and when it finally disappeared, I felt something subtle and final settle in my chest, a kind of closure, though not the clean or satisfying kind you expect after a movie's last scene, but more like the end of a drawn-out illness where you're too tired to celebrate recovery. Greg, unsurprisingly, wasn't thriving in Carl's absence. Without his mentor propping him up and whispering talking points in his ear, the man floundered like a fish tossed out of a tank. Meetings grew more chaotic, deadlines slipped, and even the junior staff began to sense that the Emperor wasn't wearing much more than a dress shirt and a decent haircut. He tried to assert authority, talking louder in meetings, sending out long emails filled with empty jargon. But you can't fake leadership, not for long, and certainly not in front of people who know exactly how little you bring to the table. Several team members started quietly coming to me with questions, requests, and in one case, a complete project that Greg had approved without understanding a single part of it. I handled it all. I cleaned up the messes. I kept things from falling apart. Not because I believed in the company anymore, and definitely not because I felt any loyalty toward the new regime, but because I didn't know how to do anything else. I'd spent too long being the guy who held everything together, and muscle memory is a hard thing to shake. Then came the email. Short, formal, and utterly predictable. It was from upper management, informing the team that, effective immediately, Greg would be stepping into the role of acting regional director on a permanent basis. No mention of a promotion process, no explanation for bypassing internal candidates. Just a quiet anointing, as if Carl's departure had never happened, and Greg's tenure had always been the plan. The message didn't even bother to include the usual platitudes about valuing internal talent or recognizing team contributions, which told me more than they probably intended. I sat there, reading that email 3 times in a row, not because I didn't understand it, but because some part of me still couldn't believe how easily they shoved the whole ugly saga into a drawer and pretended nothing had ever happened. After everything, after Carl's unraveling, the anonymous tip, the investigations, and the whispers, and the cold box walkout, they still went with the guy who could barely run a meeting without checking his notes every 5 minutes. That evening, I didn't stay late. I packed up my bag, nodded politely to the few people still lingering, and walked out without saying a word. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I found myself in the same bar I'd stumbled into the night Carl handed Greg my promotion. The same bar where I'd drowned my disbelief in cheap bourbon and stared at my own reflection like it was a stranger. This time, I sat in a booth instead of at the bar. I ordered one drink, sipped it slowly, and let the silence wrap around me like a worn coat I'd forgotten I owned. I didn't feel angry, not exactly. I didn't feel victorious either. What I felt was harder to name, something between vindicated and hollow, like winning an argument after the damage has already been done, or getting the truth out too late for it to matter in the way you once hoped it would. Claire asked me that night, after I told her about the announcement, if I regretted what I'd done, sending the tip, starting the unraveling that ended in Carl's fall. I told her the truth. I said I didn't. I told her that if I had the chance to do it again, I probably would, because for the first time in years, I'd stopped letting someone else's ambition chew through my self-respect. What I didn't tell her, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't have the words, was that revenge doesn't taste sweet the way people imagine it does. It's not fire and triumph and high fives in the hallway. It's quieter. It's colder. It sits in your stomach and doesn't let you forget how much you had to burn to feel like you finally got even. Back at work, things continued as if nothing had ever happened. The office hummed, reports got filed, numbers got crunched, and people kept showing up because bills don't care about justice. Greg avoided eye contact with me for a few days, then slipped back into casual small talk, as if we'd always been friendly. I let him talk. I nodded when it was expected. I played along because there's power in knowing more than you say, and right now I was the only one in the building who'd seen just how fast the ladder can snap when someone steps on it wrong. A few weeks later, the VP from corporate came down for a morale lunch, a flimsy excuse to shake hands and pretend we were all one big happy team. During dessert, she pulled me aside and said she'd heard about my continued contributions and that I was on the radar for future advancement. I smiled, thanked her, and filed the comment under the same mental drawer where I kept all of Carl's broken promises. I knew better now. Promotions don't go to the people who earn them. They go to the people who already have the keys. So no, I didn't get the job. But I got something else. I got the truth out. I got the bastard fired. I got the satisfaction of watching the man who used my back as a ladder fall face first into the same mud he'd flung at everyone else. Maybe that doesn't come with a new title or a bump in salary, but some victories aren't about recognition. They're about reclaiming what you lost when someone convinced you to stay quiet for too long. Whether or not I went too far, that's not for me to decide. Maybe I did. Maybe Carl had it coming. Maybe I'll always wonder what would have happened if I had kept my head down and waited one more year. But here's what I know. Sometimes the only justice you get is the kind you carve out with your own two hands, even if no one claps when you do it. And sometimes the only reward is knowing the next time someone tries to bury you, they'll think twice, because they'll remember what happened to the last guy who mistook silence for weakness.